Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at a pretty fascinating perspective on Islam and its origins. You sent over some materials arguing for the truth of Islam.
Right.
They use scientific discoveries and interpretations of the Quran and the Old Testament. It claims to reveal these surprising connections between these different areas. What do you think? We're ready to explore this together.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very intrigued by how this material tries to kind of weave together things like cosmology and physics with biblical prophecy to support its claims. So yeah, let's dive into some of the specifics and see what we find.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the Big Bang.
Okay.
The source highlights a verse from the Quran that talks about the heavens forming from smoke. It contrasts this with the idea that was common at the time that the universe arose from water. This seems like a pretty bold claim. Do you think there's any merit to it?
It is interesting. Yeah, the verse is from Surah Fussilat. It states, "Then he directed himself to the heaven while it was smoke." Now think about when this was revealed. The prevailing scientific understanding at the time was rooted in the classical elements you know, with water often seen as that fundamental element of creation. So for the Quran to use smoke instead of water, well, that definitely challenges that existing worldview.
So how does that verse align with what we know about the Big Bang from modern cosmology?
Right.
Is it really a scientific miracle like the source claims?
Well, let's think about what we know about the early universe. You know, modern science describes it as this incredibly hot, dense state, a sort of cosmic soup of particles. And when you think about it, smoke could be a way of describing that primordial state. It's definitely not a direct scientific prediction, but the convergence of these ideas, centuries apart, is at the very least thought-provoking. You know, it raises questions about the source of this knowledge and how it might relate to scientific discoveries.
That's a really interesting point. I can see why this argument would be compelling to some people. But, you know, for someone like me who's more interested in the science side of things, it feels a bit too poetic.
Okay.
To be taken literally. What do you think?
I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
It's important to remember that the Quran wasn't written as a science textbook.
Right.
But perhaps instead of looking for these literal scientific explanations, we can appreciate the way it uses imagery and metaphor to convey profound ideas about the universe.
All right, fair enough. Next up, we move from the universe's beginnings to the very fabric of space itself. The source connects another Quranic source that emphasizes the constructed nature of the sky.
Okay.
With a groundbreaking discovery of gravitational waves and the concept of space-time. This one sounds a bit more complex. Are you ready to try to break it down?
Let's give it a try. The verse in question is from Surah Al-Dariyat, "And the heaven we constructed with strength." To understand the source's connection here, we need to delve into some pretty fascinating physics. Imagine space-time as a flexible fabric, kind of like a trampoline.
Okay.
Massive objects like stars and planets create these warps and curves in this fabric.
Okay, I'm picturing it. So where do gravitational waves come into play?
Well, when extremely massive objects, like black holes, collide, they create ripples in this fabric of space-time. These ripples are known as gravitational waves. And these waves were actually predicted by Einstein's theory of general relativity way back in the early 20th century. And you know what's amazing? Scientists were finally able to detect these waves just a few years ago in 2017, an achievement that earned them the Nobel Prize in Physics.
Wow, that's incredible. But I'm still a bit fuzzy on how this all relates back to the Quran. Help me connect the dots.
The source argues that the discovery of gravitational waves and the concept of space-time as this dynamic, flexible fabric, well, it supports the idea that the sky or space isn't just empty nothingness. It has a structure, a fabric, and in a sense, it's constructed, right? It's like the Quran was hinting at this complex understanding of the universe that science is only now beginning to grasp.
So it's suggesting that the Quran had this scientific insight centuries before modern science.
Yeah, it's certainly an intriguing interpretation. While the verse doesn't explicitly describe gravitational waves or space-time in the way that modern physics does, it does present this idea that the universe isn't static. It's dynamic, it has structure, and it was formed with strength.
Now here's where it gets really interesting, the expanding universe. The source claims the Quran actually predicted this concept centuries before scientists even considered it. Points to the verse that follows the one we just discussed. And indeed, we are its expander. What do you make of this claim?
This is definitely one of the more audacious claims that the source makes. Remember that the idea that the universe is expanding, well, that wasn't even a scientific concept until the 1920s. when astronomers observed that distant galaxies are moving away from us. And even Einstein himself initially resisted the idea of an expanding universe. He later called his opposition to the idea his greatest blunder.
Right. So it's mind-blowing to think that the Quran might have alluded to this concept long before modern science caught up. But is it really a prediction?
It's true that the verse doesn't explicitly describe the expansion in scientific terms, but it does present this image of a dynamic, active universe. It suggests a universe that's not fixed or static, but one that's being actively expanded by a higher power.
It's making me wonder if maybe we shouldn't dismiss these connections so quickly. There might be more to these verses than meets the eye.
Exactly. Even if we don't interpret them as these literal scientific predictions, they can still spark curiosity and encourage us to think about these potential points of connection between faith and science.
All right, let's shift gears for a moment and move to a more earthly phenomenon. The source uses a poetic analogy to describe a verse about the earth breathing in the morning. It claims this verse actually hints at atmospheric processes driven by the sun's heat. What do you think, poetic license or scientific insight?
This is a fascinating example of how the source kind of blends scientific concepts with poetic language. The verse from Surah Al-Takwir simply states, "And by the morning when it breathes." The source interprets this as a metaphorical description of what happens each day. As the sun rises, it heats the Earth's surface, causing the air to warm and rise. This rising air is then replaced by cooler air from the upper atmosphere, creating a cycle of air movement.
So the earth breathing is really a metaphor for this atmospheric circulation.
Exactly. The source draws a parallel between this natural process and the inhales and exhales of breath, right? It paints this beautiful picture of the earth coming alive each morning.
It's a beautiful image.
Yeah.
But do you think it's fair to call it a scientific insight? Or is it stretching things a bit?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Quran uses language in a way that's meant to resonate with people on a deeper level, to inspire awe and wonder.
Okay.
While the analogy of the earth breathing might not be a scientific explanation in the modern sense, it does capture the essence of this natural process that sustains life on our planet.
That's a great point. Sometimes we can get so caught up in looking for those literal scientific explanations that we miss the beauty and poetry of these ancient texts.
And sometimes that poetry can lead us to deeper insights and a greater appreciation for the interconnectedness of the natural world.
Now, let's venture back into the celestial realm. The source claims that the moon was originally a fiery mass, much like the sun, and connects this to a verse about the sign of the night being erased. What's your take on this one?
This interpretation is based on a verse from Surah Al-Isra, which states, "Then we erased the sign of the night and made the sign of the day visible." The source identifies the sign of the night as the moon and the sign of the day as the sun. It then goes on to suggest that the moon was once a fiery body, like the sun, but its light was somehow erased over time.
So how does this interpretation hold up against what we know about the moon's formation from modern science?
Well, it's actually quite interesting when you consider the prevailing scientific theory about the moon's origin. Scientists believe that the moon formed from debris ejected when a Mars-sized object collided with the early Earth. And this debris would have been incredibly hot, a molten mass that likely glowed brightly.
So you're saying the moon really did have a fiery past?
Yeah. And while the verse doesn't explicitly state that the moon was once like the sun, the source's interpretation does align with our scientific understanding of the moon's early formation.
This is all incredibly fascinating. It's making me rethink how I view these ancient texts.
Right.
And their potential connections to scientific discoveries.
That's the beauty of exploring these ideas with an open mind, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes the connections we find can challenge our assumptions and lead us to a deeper understanding of both science and faith.
Welcome back to our deep dive into this argument for the truth of Islam.
Okay.
Last time we explored some pretty intriguing connections between the Quran and modern scientific discoveries.
All right.
Now we're about to step into the world of biblical prophecy.
All right.
You ready to see what the source has uncovered?
Definitely. I'm very curious to see how the source connects these ancient texts. It claims to find prophecies in the Old Testament that specifically point to the coming of Muhammad.
Oh.
It's a bold claim.
Right.
And I'm interested to see how it holds up.
All right, let's jump right in. The source starts by focusing on a verse in Deuteronomy that predicts a prophet like Moses.
Okay.
It argues that this prophecy is actually referring to Muhammad. What do you think? Could there be something to this?
Well, the verse in question, Deuteronomy 18.18, says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brothers." The source really hinges its argument on that phrase, their brothers. It suggests that this refers to the Arabs who, like the Israelites, are descendants of Abraham.
So the source is saying that this prophecy couldn't be about any other prophet from the Israelites because it specifically mentions a prophet coming from among their brothers.
Right.
That's an interesting interpretation.
It is. And to further support its claim, the source points out that Muhammad, being a descendant of Ishmael, Abraham's son, fits this description perfectly.
Okay.
It argues that no other prophet arising from the Arabs has fulfilled the criteria of being like Moses in the way that Muhammad did.
Okay. I can see how the source is building its case. But what exactly does it mean for a prophet to be like Moses? What kind of parallels does it draw between these two figures?
The source highlights several similarities between Moses and Muhammad. For example, both are described as prophets who received divine revelations, led their followers on migrations, and faced opposition and persecution from those who rejected their message. Both called their people to monotheism, urging them to worship the one true God.
That's interesting. Are there any verses in the Quran itself that might support this connection between Moses and Muhammad?
There is one that the source points to.
Okay.
It cites a verse from Surah al-Muzammil, which says, "We have sent to you a messenger as a witness upon you, just as we sent to Pharaoh a messenger." The source interprets this as a clear indication that Muhammad saw himself as following in the footsteps of Moses, sent to deliver a similar message of monotheism.
You know, it's fascinating how the source weaves together these different threads from the Quran and the Old Testament.
Right.
But I have to admit, I'm a bit skeptical.
Sure.
This interpretation of Deuteronomy 18.1 seems like a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
Are there other ways to interpret this prophecy?
You're right to be skeptical. It's important to acknowledge that this prophecy has been a subject of debate and interpretation for centuries. Within Jewish tradition, some interpret it as referring to a succession of prophets,
Okay.
not a single individual. And of course, in Christian tradition, this prophecy is often seen as pointing to Jesus.
That's a great point. It highlights the inherent complexities of interpreting ancient prophecies,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with texts from different religious traditions.
Yeah.
It seems like context is everything.
Absolutely. It's a reminder that we need to approach these interpretations with a critical eye, considering the different perspectives and historical contexts that might influence our understanding.
Okay, let's move on to the next biblical prophecy the source explores.
All right.
This one comes from the book of Isaiah, and it's fascinating because it connects to the Adhan,
Okay.
the Islamic call to prayer,
Right.
and even to a specific location near the Prophet's mosque in Medina. Can you tell us more about this?
So this interpretation is based on two verses from Isaiah 42. The first verse says, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights, I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations." Then in verse 11 of the same chapter we read, "Let the desert and its cities lift up their voice, the villages that Kedar inhabits. Let the inhabitants of Selah sing for joy. Let them shout from the tops of the mountains."
Okay, I'm following so far. But how does the source connect these verses to the Adhan in Medina?
Well, it focuses on a few key words and phrases. First, it points out that Kedar was a son of Ishmael and an ancestor of the Arabs.
Okay.
This, according to the source, links the prophecy directly to Muhammad's lineage.
I see. So it's using genealogy to make the connection.
Exactly. Then it interprets the phrase, "Let the desert and its cities lift up their voice," as a prediction of the Adhan being called out in Arabian cities and villages.
Yeah.
So like Isaiah foresaw the sound of the Islamic call to prayer echoing across the Arabian Peninsula.
And what about the mention of Selah? What's the significance of that?
This is where it gets really specific. The source identifies Selah as a particular location in Medina, about 500 meters from the Prophet's mosque.
Wow.
It claims that this geographical reference adds even more weight to its interpretation, suggesting that Isaiah was pinpointing the very place where Muhammad's mission would unfold.
Wow, that's incredibly precise. But wait, for those of us who aren't familiar, can you remind us why Medina is so important in Islamic tradition?
Of course, Medina is the city where Muhammad and his followers migrated to after facing persecution in Mecca. It became the center of the early Muslim community and played a vital role in the development of Islam.
Okay.
The source is suggesting that Isaiah's prophecy pinpointed this very city centuries before these events took place.
It's quite a claim, but I'm wondering, is there any historical or archaeological evidence to back it up? I mean, we're talking about interpretations of names and locations from an ancient text.
Right.
It seems like a lot could get lost in translation, don't you think?
You're right to be cautious. While the source presents these connections as compelling evidence for the truth of Islam,
Right.
it's important to remember that interpreting biblical names and locations can be tricky. There might be alternative interpretations of these passages, and it's always a good idea to consult additional historical and scholarly sources to get a more complete picture.
So we're encouraged to do our own research and not just take these interpretations at face value.
Exactly. It's about approaching these claims with a healthy dose of curiosity and critical thinking.
Okay, let's keep digging. The source's next move is to delve into a more obscure prophecy from the book of Genesis, linking the mysterious figure of Shiloh to Muhammad.
Oh.
This one sounds particularly intriguing. What can you tell us about it?
The prophecy is found in Genesis 49.9 philo, which reads, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." Now, the interpretation hinges on the meaning of Shiloh.
That's right. The source seems to put a lot of emphasis on how this word is interpreted. What does it actually mean?
The source defines Shiloh as shackles remover. It connects this to the idea of a prophet who would come and relieve people from the burdens of previous laws or religious practices.
So how does it tie this interpretation back to Muhammad specifically?
The source argues that Muhammad, by introducing a new religious law with Islam, fulfilled this prophecy of Shiloh.
Okay.
It sees Islam as offering liberation from what it considers the restrictive and burdensome laws of the Old Testament.
To bolster its claim, the source also brings in a verse from the Quran, right?
Yes, it does. The source cites Surah Al-Araf, verse 157, which describes the prophet as one who relieves them of their burden and the shackles which were upon them. It interprets this as a direct reference to the prophecy of Shiloh, suggesting that the Quran itself acknowledges this connection.
That's quite a creative approach to interfaith interpretation, blending these different threads from the Quran and the Old Testament to support its argument. But as with any interpretation, especially one that involves such weighty claims, it's crucial to consider other perspectives.
I agree. While the source presents a compelling case, it's always beneficial to explore these ideas from multiple angles and consult scholarly analyses that offer different viewpoints.
Okay, now for an even more intriguing claim. The source says that the Prophet Muhammad's name is hidden within a Hebrew word in the book of Haggai. Honestly, this one sounds almost too good to be true.
Right.
What do you think?
This claim centers around Haggai 2.7, which reads, "I will shake all nations, and what is desired by all nations will come." The source focuses specifically on the Hebrew word mushtaha, which is translated as desired in this verse.
And how does the source connect this word to Muhammad's name? I'm on the edge of my seat here.
It argues that mushtaha can also mean praiseworthy in Hebrew,
Okay.
which, according to the source, is equivalent to the name Muhammad.
So is it really that simple? Is Muhammad's name literally hidden within the Hebrew text?
Well, the source actually takes it a step further.
Okay.
It proposes a reinterpretation of the entire phrase. It argues that the correct Hebrew reading is, "And Muhammad of the illiterates will come."
Hold on. Muhammad of the illiterates. Where'd that come from?
Yeah.
This is getting more and more fascinating.
The source makes a rather bold claim that the phrase "all nations" in the original Hebrew actually refers to the illiterate.
Okay, now that's a pretty significant reinterpretation. How does it connect to Muhammad?
In Islamic tradition, Muhammad is often referred to as the unlettered prophet, meaning he was not formally educated in reading or writing. The source draws a parallel between this aspect of Muhammad's life and its reinterpreted phrase from Haggai.
It's certainly an interesting connection. But I have to say, this claim hinges on some very specific interpretations of Hebrew words and phrases.
Yeah.
Is there anything to back this up? Are there any independent sources or scholarly opinions that support this interpretation?
It's definitely a claim that warrants further investigation. As with any interpretation of ancient texts, especially those involving different languages and religious traditions,
Right.
it's crucial to consider various perspectives and scholarly analyses. This is one of those claims where you really need to dig deep and do your own research before forming any conclusions.
So while the source's interpretation is intriguing, we're encouraged to approach it with a healthy dose of skepticism and explore different viewpoints.
I can definitely see why you'd want to consult multiple sources before making any judgments.
Absolutely. Critical thinking and informed inquiry are essential when navigating complex claims like this. It's all about seeking a deeper understanding through research and thoughtful engagement with different perspectives.
All right, let's move on. The source now shifts its focus to Daniel's vision of 4 kingdoms.
Okay.
It claims that this vision actually predicts the emergence of Islam and even the conquest of Constantinople. This sounds pretty monumental. Can you shed some light on Daniel's vision and how the source interprets it? Daniel's vision, as described in Daniel 7, involves 4 beasts, each representing a successive kingdom that would rule the earth. These are often interpreted as the Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman empires.
So where does Islam fit into this vision of 4 kingdoms? I'm curious to hear the source's take on this.
The source claims that after these 4 kingdoms, a new power would arise, represented in the vision as the saints of the Most High.
Oh, okay.
It connects this emergence of the saints with the rise of Islam, suggesting that this new faith would challenge the dominance of the previous kingdoms and eventually rise to prominence.
The source also makes a point of mentioning Constantine the Great.
Right.
And a timeline of 3.5 centuries.
Yes.
What's the significance of this?
The source links Constantine, the first Roman emperor, to convert to Christianity. With the 4th kingdom in Daniel's vision, the Roman Empire, it then claims that 3.5 centuries after Constantine, a new force would emerge, conquering the previous kingdoms. According to the source, this time frame aligns perfectly with the rise of Islam, and it spread across the regions once ruled by the Babylonian, Persian, and Roman empires.
So it's suggesting that Daniel accurately predicted the rise of Islam and its military conquest centuries in advance.
That's essentially the argument. It even highlights the conquest of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, by the Ottoman Turks in 1453, as a fulfillment of Daniel's prediction that the saints would rule over the 4th kingdom.
Okay, so the source is using historical events to support its interpretation of Daniel's vision. But I'm wondering, is this a common interpretation of Daniel's prophecy? Are there other ways to understand this vision?
You raise a very valid point. As with any historical and prophetic interpretation, it's important to consider alternative perspectives and historical analyses. It's crucial to approach these interpretations with a critical and informed mindset, remembering that there are often multiple layers of meaning and different schools of thought when it comes to understanding prophecies.
Right. It's all about looking at things from different angles and not jumping to conclusions based on a single interpretation.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that history is complex, and attributing specific events to ancient prophecies can be a slippery slope.
Well said. All right, on to the final stop on our prophetic tour, the Kaaba in Mecca.
Okay.
The source claims that verses from Isaiah actually foretell its significance as a center of monotheism.
Right.
This is fascinating. Tell us more about what Isaiah supposedly says about this.
The source focuses on Isaiah 60.1-7, which describes a future time when the Lord's glory will rise upon a specific location, drawing people and nations to it. Verses 5 and 7 mention the gathering of Kedar's flocks and the rams of Nebaioth, both figures associated with the lineage of Ishmael and the Arabs.
Okay, I'm following so far.
Yeah.
But how does the source connect these verses to the Kaaba?
It argues that the gathering of flocks and rams representing sacrifices points to the Kaaba as the destination for these offerings.
Okay.
It emphasizes that the Kaaba being located in Mecca among the descendants of Kedar and Nebaioth fulfills Isaiah's prophecy of a central place of worship and monotheism.
So the source is claiming that Isaiah foresaw the Kaaba's role in Islam centuries before its establishment.
That's the interpretation being presented. It uses the biblical text to strengthen its argument for the truth of Islam, suggesting that the Kaaba's importance was divinely ordained and predicted in ancient prophecies.
This is pretty mind-blowing. But as with the previous interpretations, it's important to remember that these passages might have alternative readings and perspectives.
Right.
It seems like every interpretation depends on a particular lens and understanding of the text.
Absolutely. It's always crucial to approach these claims with an informed and critical mindset, considering the broader context of biblical scholarship and religious interpretation.
Well, we've certainly covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
From Shiloh to Mushtaha to the Kaaba.
Right.
The source has presented some truly thought-provoking interpretations of biblical prophecy.
It sparked a lot of curiosity and raised interesting questions about the relationship between different religious traditions, the interpretation of ancient texts, and the interplay of faith and history.
It's definitely given us a lot to think about. Where do we go from here?
Well, we've explored the source's arguments based on science and biblical prophecy. Now it's time to step back and consider the bigger picture. What does it all mean? And what are the implications of these claims? Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll synthesize everything we've discussed and explore these questions together.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been on quite a journey exploring these arguments for the truth of Islam, haven't we?
Yeah, it's been fascinating.
We've examined how the source material connects scientific discoveries, Quranic verses, and Old Testament prophecies to build its case. I have to say it's been an eye-opening experience, to say the least.
It really has. Yeah, we've covered so much ground.
Right.
The origins of the universe to the intricacies of biblical interpretation. The source material definitely presents a very specific perspective.
Right.
One that attempts to create a dialogue between modern scientific understanding and these ancient texts.
One thing that really struck me throughout this deep dive is the sheer audacity of the source's claims.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't shy away from making these bold connections, even when those connections might seem a little far-fetched to some.
Yeah.
It's almost like it's challenging us to rethink our assumptions about science and religion and history.
I agree. It seems to be pushing back against this idea that faith and reason are somehow incompatible.
Right.
Suggesting that there can be points of convergence. Moments where scientific discoveries seem to resonate with insights found in ancient religious texts.
Exactly. It's like it's saying, hey, what if these ancient texts contain wisdom that we're only now beginning to understand through the lens of modern science? It's a thought-provoking idea, even if you don't agree with all of the specific interpretations presented.
Right. It invites us to consider the possibility that there might be multiple layers of meaning within these texts, layers that perhaps previous generations weren't equipped to fully grasp.
Okay, so let's try to synthesize everything we've discussed. What does this all mean? What are some of the key takeaways from this deep dive? I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that the relationship between faith and science is complex and multifaceted.
Right.
The source material highlights this complexity by attempting to find these points of connection between modern scientific understanding and the Quran. It encourages us to think about the possibility of a dialogue between these seemingly disparate realms of knowledge.
That's a great point. It's challenging the notion that faith and science are inherently at odds with each other. Instead, it's suggesting that they might actually be complementary.
Yeah.
That each can enrich our understanding of the other.
Exactly. And it also underscores the importance of interpretation when it comes to understanding ancient texts.
Right.
The source material relies heavily on specific interpretations of Quranic verses and biblical prophecies to support its argument.
Right.
It demonstrates how different perspectives and approaches to interpretation can lead to vastly different conclusions.
That reminds me of our discussion about the prophecy in Deuteronomy.
Okay.
The one about the prophet like Moses. The source interprets it as referring to Muhammad, while others see it as pointing to Jesus or a succession of prophets. It's a clear example of how context and perspective can shape our understanding of these ancient texts.
Absolutely. It highlights the subjective nature of interpretation, especially when dealing with texts that have been translated and reinterpreted across centuries and cultures.
I think it's a really valuable insight to take away from this deep dive. It's a reminder that we should always approach these interpretations with a critical eye.
Mm-hmm.
Considering the source's perspective and potential biases, we shouldn't just blindly accept any single interpretation as the absolute truth.
I couldn't agree more. It's about engaging in thoughtful inquiry, exploring different perspectives, and forming our own informed conclusions.
All right, so we've talked about the source's approach to connecting science and faith.
Right.
And we've discussed the importance of interpretation when dealing with ancient texts.
Yeah.
But what about you personally? What stands out to you from all of this? Were there any particular connections or arguments that you found especially compelling?
Honestly, I found the source's attempt to bridge the gap between modern cosmology and the Quran's descriptions of the universe to be incredibly fascinating. The way it connected the verse about the heavens forming from smoke to the scientific understanding of the early universe as this hot, dense state was quite thought-provoking. It made me wonder if there might be more to these ancient descriptions than we initially realize.
I can see why that would resonate with you.
Yep.
It's definitely one of those arguments that makes you pause and consider the possibility that these ancient texts might contain insights that predate modern science.
Exactly. And even if we don't interpret it as a literal scientific prediction, it's still a powerful example of how these texts can inspire awe and wonder about the universe.
For me, what really stuck with me was the source's interpretation of Daniel's vision of the four kingdoms. The way it connected those kingdoms to specific historical empires and then linked the emergence of the saints to the rise of Islam was quite compelling. It presented this grand, sweeping narrative of history unfolding according to a divine plan.
Yeah, that interpretation definitely invites us to consider the grand sweep of history and the interplay of empires and religions and cultural forces that have shaped our world. It's a reminder that we're all part of a much larger story that stretches back centuries and continues to unfold before our eyes.
Well said. It seems like we've both taken away some valuable insights from this deep dive. What would you say to our listener who's been with us on this journey? What's the one thing you want them to remember as we wrap up our exploration?
I think the most important thing to remember is that this deep dive is just the beginning of a much larger journey of exploration.
Right.
We've examined one particular perspective, but there are countless others out there waiting to be discovered. The source material has given us a lot to think about, but it's ultimately up to each individual to decide how these arguments resonate with their own understanding of the world.
That's a great point. This deep dive has provided a wealth of information and perspectives, but it's just a starting point. The journey continues, inviting us to delve deeper, question our assumptions, and seek our own truths.
Exactly, and that's the beauty of it. Knowledge is a journey, not a destination. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
Well said. That's the perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into the arguments for the truth of Islam. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics, seek out diverse perspectives, and engage in thoughtful dialogue.